ViewSonic, the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and following on from the launch day of the RX 590 when we looked at the Sapphire RX 590 Nitro Plus, today we have another card on the table. This one is from XFX and it is called the Fat Boy. So aside from the interesting name, this is actually a relatively basic card, but then again it does come in at £250, so the question we're really going to be asking today is, what do you get for your money? We're going to start with a look at the design then, and overall I have to say this probably isn't my favourite card in terms of design. It's got this black plastic shroud which, you know, is okay, but then it's got this kind of carbon fibre, this faux carbon fibre finish, which I guess is meant to make it look a little bit more premium, but in my opinion it probably ends up having the opposite effect and makes it look just a little bit cheap. Although again, subjectively speaking, you're probably going to have your own opinion on this. I just personally think it doesn't look that great. On the front of the shroud though as well, we do have those two 100mm fans. These do have a fan stop mode, so when your card's under light load, the fans will stop spinning, and you can see they've got these kind of red central hubs as well, which stands out from all the black plastic of the shroud itself. Just along the outside of the fans as well, you can see some ridges kind of built into the shroud, which again, meant to give a bit more interest, but overall, like I said, I'm not too keen on the look of this card. Personally, I feel like, you know, it looks like it could be coming from 4 or 5 years ago. But again, this is all subjective. You might have your own opinion on the look of the card. Moving on to the dimensions of the card though, the Fat Boy actually measures 270 by 124 by 53mm. Again, considering this one is actually called the Fat Boy, XFX has called this card the Fat Boy, I don't actually think it's that big. I'd in fact say it's probably actually just pretty average for a card coming out in 2018, considering it is a 2.5 slot thickness. Moving over to the front of the card though, here we can see there is an XFX logo which is actually stuck onto the front of the shroud, so it's a sticker you could pull off if you wanted. But if we move past that, we can see the two power connectors. It's one 6-pin and one 8-pin for the Fat Boy. Although of more interest is just to the left of that, we can see a tiny little dual BIOS switch. So you can either run the card in the performance BIOS or in the stealth BIOS, and it's only a fan curve change, so clock speed stays the same regardless, and we're going to test out the differences between those two BIOS later on in the review. Flipping over to the backplate now, it's an aluminium backplate, and again it's a pretty simple design, although I do prefer the look of the backplates to the front of the shroud. It's got this kind of two-tone black and dark grey sections, and you can also see the XFX logo there printed on the right hand side. Overall, like I said, quite simple but pretty good looking, and I'd rather it had a backplate than not. One more thing to mention just before moving on as well is the display outputs. The XFX Fat Boy RX 590 has 3 display ports, one HDMI, that's a 2.0B, as well as one DVI. But now we're going to talk about opening up the card. This only requires the removal of 6 screws from the backplate of the card, and then we can see the PCB and the heatsink come free. The first thing to note though, before actually moving on to the heatsink itself, is actually just how much the actual shroud of the card overhangs past the PCB. I measured it to be around 4.5cm longer than the PCB itself, and considering actually the heatsink only takes up a very, very small amount of this extra space, it does look like there's quite a lot of wasted space going on there. So this card could reasonably be about 4cm shorter, and it wouldn't affect absolutely anything apart from just cutting off a bit of the plastic shroud at the back. To me, that just suggests XFX is kind of going for this bigger is better approach. They want you to think, okay, you're getting this bigger card, therefore it's going to run cooler, it's going to be quieter, for instance. But in actual fact, a fair bit of it is actually just empty space. Still, if we get back to the PCB, we can see it uses a 6+1 power phase design, 6 phases for the GPU, 1 phase for the memory, and there's also 8GB of GDDR5. I'm so used to saying GDDR6 from all the RTX reviews, but the RX 590 does use 8GB of GDDR5 memory, and that comes from Micron. The GPU as well, as we know, is still based on the Polaris architecture, but the fabrication has now been switched to a 12nm process as opposed to the 14nm of the RX 580. Moving on now to the heatsink, this is again relatively simple. It's got 4 copper heat pipes, there's 2 6mm heat pipes and 2 8mm heat pipes, and these actually feed into a copper cold plate which connects to the GPU itself. There's also 2 separate cold plates, one for the VRAM chips as well as one for the inductors, and these all have all the necessary thermal pads as we would expect. Now we're going to move on to performance, and it's worth saying here we're going to show you our 1080p charts, as the RX 590 is, in my opinion, still very much best for 1080p. You can see 1440p and 4K benchmarks over on kitguru.net, as well as our full testing methodology, but just for this video we're going to be showing you our 1080p benchmarks. It is also worth noting that for all of our 3D Mark and games testing we use the card with the performance BIOS, although when we get to our thermals, noise and power consumption, we did test those with both the stealth BIOS and the performance BIOS, so we can see how they compare. If we bring up our 3D Mark charts now, starting with Firestrike and then moving across into our suite of games, we can see that this XFX Fatboy performs very, very similarly to the Sapphire RX 590 Nitro Plus Special Edition that we did on launch day. They both perform very, very similarly. That being said, the XFX does prove to be ever so slightly slower when it comes to our games. We can see across the different titles, the margin does differ slightly, but it's only a fraction of a frame behind. So in the real world, you're very unlikely to notice the difference, although you can see in these benchmarks, when we're measuring it to a decimal point of a frame per second, the XFX does come in ever so slightly slower, although the difference is far from big. So even though it's far from a big difference, it is quite interesting to see the XFX card come in marginally slower. That's because it actually has a faster boost clock of 1580 MHz compared to 1560 MHz for the Sapphire Nitro RX 590. The thing that edges it for the Sapphire though is that the memory does come overclocked out of the box. That one ships with 2100 MHz memory, whereas this XFX memory is left stock at 2000 MHz. Both cards hold their boost clocks with absolute stability as well. We can clearly see the XFX card was holding absolutely rock steady at 1580 MHz. And the only reason it varied from that was when we switched to the Stealth BIOS, and it was running a bit warmer, so therefore the clock speed was dialed down ever so slightly, but it still averaged 1564 MHz. Speaking of thermals, the performance BIOS did a fair bit better as expected. It peaked at just 69 degrees, whereas if we switched to the Stealth BIOS, that did run a fair bit warmer, peaking at 80 degrees, and that explains the reason why it couldn't quite hold its boost clock at that mode. It was warming up, so the boost clock just had to kind of dial down slightly in order to offset the increase in temperature. The flip side to the thermals though is our noise testing, and the Stealth BIOS did very, very well here. It peaked at just over 41 decibels, which is actually one of the best results on our graph, whereas the performance BIOS peaked at over 48 decibels, and that makes it one of the louder cards. So it was actually quite audible and it was getting a fair bit annoying. So in a nutshell, that actually sums up the dual BIOS functionality of the XFX Fatboy very well. It really does seem to be an either or situation. So you can either have it as a hot card, but that runs quite quiet, or you can have it as a much louder card that runs cooler. So very much either or. In that regard, I have to say that the Sapphire RX 580 Nitro Plus that we looked at on launch day definitely cuts a much better balance between thermals and noise. That's because it still actually performed very, very similarly to the Stealth BIOS in terms of noise levels. It actually peaked just under 42 decibels, whereas the GPU core only peaked at 72 degrees. So still nice and quiet and still actually quite cool as well. So you get a much better balance, whereas the XFX Fatboy is definitely an either or situation. Moving on to power consumption now though, just a reminder, we do have dedicated sensors in both the PCIe slot as well as the PCI power connectors, and that lets us measure the power consumption for the graphics card only, not the system as a whole. So with that in mind, we can see the XFX card was drawing about 225 watts under load. It didn't really change that much depending on the BIOS we use, so it is actually slightly more frugal than the Sapphire RX 590, although if we do look at the bigger picture, we can see RX 590 is still actually quite power hungry, and compared to the GTX 1060 or GTX 1070, it does look to be significantly more inefficient. The last area to touch on is manual overclocking, and as we found with our RX 590 Sapphire card, there is very limited headroom when it comes to the XFX Fatboy. We could get the core stable at 1615 MHz, so an extra 35 MHz, and then we could get the memory up to 2175 MHz. This brought only minor gains when it came to 3D Mark's Firestrike, and we also tested at 1080p with Deus Ex Mankind Divided and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but as you can see, we really didn't see much in terms of increase there. What it did bring though was even louder noise levels. It actually peaked at over 52 decibels, which, considering it was loud enough in the first place, I really don't think the extra noise is worth the marginal gains you get from that 35 MHz overclock. So then, wrapping up this review, I have to say that the XFX Fatboy, aside from the interesting name, is actually not a bad card. It does bring a good level of 1080p performance. It's about 8 to 10% faster than the RX 580, and it does that for £250, which at the time of filming is one of the cheaper RX 590 options. For only £10 more though, I really would recommend going for the Sapphire RX 590 Nitro Plus. That card is just £260, and it is actually ever so slightly faster, but the main thing for me really is how much better it is when it comes to the balance of thermals and noise. This XFX card is either cool and loud, or it's quiet and hot. It's really an either or situation, whereas if we look at the results from the Sapphire, it is consistently cool and quiet regardless of the load. So for £250, this XFX Fatboy is certainly not a bad card, and if you find it on sale, it still gives you RX 590 performance. But for me, if you're spending £250, you might as well spend an extra tenner, spend £260 and get the Sapphire RX 590 Nitro Plus Special Edition instead. So I'm Dominic for Kit Guru. This has been my review of the XFX Fatboy. Please do leave us a like and a comment. If you're new to the channel as well, welcome. We have quite a large team actually bringing you all sorts of content. We'll be looking at graphics cards, we'll be looking at laptops, gaming chairs, peripherals, all that kind of stuff. So do hit subscribe if you don't want to miss out on any of our content, and also hit the bell icon to be notified about all of our future videos that will be coming soon. But until then, I will see you in the next video.